The train left Lucia at a small coastal station that smelled of rust, salt, and rain. The wind came from the sea, cold, tugging loose strands of her dark hair. On the empty platform, the distant sound of waves seemed to whisper her name, as if the ocean itself remembered her. She carried only a worn suitcase, a box of paints, and an urn wrapped in white linen. It was light, yet it weighed like stone. Inside were the ashes of Matteo, the man who had been her light, her storm, and her ruin. San Villaro seemed suspended in time. The houses had peeling walls and shuttered windows. No tourists, no laughter, only the constant rhythm of the waves and the distant toll of a church bell. Lucia walked through narrow streets until she found the house she had rented by letter, an old wooden home, its blue paint faded, facing the sea. Inside, the air smelled of salt and memory. The walls held echoes of old voices, perhaps ghosts of summers long gone. Lucia placed the urn on a table, removed her wet coat and opened the window. The wind rushed in, scattering dust and cold. She stood there, watching the grey horizon. The sea seemed endless, an open wound that would not heal. Matteo had loved the sea, said it was made of memories of everything the world tried to forget. Lucia closed her eyes. For a moment, she almost felt him beside her. But when she opened them again, there was only emptiness and the insistent sound of the waves crashing against the rocks. The silence of San Villaro wrapped around her like a veil. It was the beginning, or perhaps the end. The sound of the sea woke Lucia before dawn. The grey light filtered through the cracks in the shutters, painting the room in a faded ivory hue. The wind still blew, carrying with it the salty scent of the waves crashing against the rocks below. She wandered through the house in silence. Every room seemed frozen in time. A teacup forgotten on the table, a rocking chair covered in dust, faded portraits of faces she did not know. There was a strange melancholy breathing through that place, as if the house itself missed someone. In the back room, she found a canvas leaning against the wall. The painting was unfinished. The face of a man emerging from shadows, soft features, eyes that seemed to follow her. Lucia stepped closer, hesitating. She didn't recognize him, yet something about his expression felt familiar, the same quietness Matteo used to have when he painted. She ran her fingers lightly over the dry surface. Dust clung to her skin like ash. For a brief moment it seemed as though the man in the portrait wanted to speak, but the wind rose and the moment dissolved. Lucia returned to the makeshift studio she had set up near the window. She spread out her paints but hesitated before the blank canvas. Then, dipping the brush into grey, she began to paint the sea, not as she saw it, but as she felt it. Heavy, silent, full of memory. By the time she looked up, the day was already fading. The sunset burned in tones of iron and silver. Outside, the sea was still calling her name, Therakaritis. In the days that followed, Lucia wandered through the narrow streets of San Villaro in search of something she could not name. The sound of the sea followed her like a living memory, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce, as if the ocean itself shared her restlessness. One afternoon, the church bell rang unexpectedly. The metallic sound echoed across the hills, bringing to mind Matteo's voice, laughing, saying that a village's bell always marked the heart of those who left. Moved by impulse, Lucia followed the sound. The church stood on a hill, surrounded by old olive trees and moss-covered walls. The doors were slightly open. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of damp stone and aged wood. Shafts of light filtered through cracked stained glass, scattering colors across the worn floor. Then, she saw him. A man, his back turned, working over a block of marble. His hands, large, steady, yet marked by scars, carved carefully at something she could not yet see. The rhythmic sound of the chisel striking stone filled the silence of the church like a prayer. Lucia hesitated, but something within her made her step closer. "It's beautiful," she whispered, almost to herself. The man turned. He was tall, his expression serene yet weary, like someone accustomed to carrying secrets. There was a shadow of sadness in his face, but also a quiet calm. "It's not finished," he replied, brushing white dust from his hands. "No sculpture ever is, not until someone sees it." Lucia smiled faintly, not knowing exactly why. He introduced himself as Adrian Verano, sculptor and restorer of the old church. He told her he came there every day to restore what time had taken: the broken statues, the faded altar, the lost faith. As they spoke, Lucia noticed a faint burn mark on his wrist. A small, barely visible scar, yet something in it sent a chill through her. She looked away, unsure why the sight unsettled her so deeply. Before she left, Adrian offered her shelter from the rain beginning to fall. She refused, but thanked him. Outside, as she descended the hill, Lucia had the strange feeling that this man knew the sea, and perhaps the same kind of pain she carried within her. Psyche! And the days began to stretch again, and the sky over San Villaro shifted between shades of lead and silver. Lucia tried to paint, but every canvas ended in grey, as if the world itself had forgotten colour. Still, something inside her was beginning to stir. At times, in the late afternoon, she would walk up to the church to watch Adrian work. She said nothing. She simply watched him in silence, like someone witnessing faith being shaped out of stone. His hands fascinated her. They were strong, calloused, yet moved with an almost sacred gentleness. With every strike of the chisel, she felt the sound vibrate within her, a distant echo of what she once called love. One afternoon, Adrian lifted his face and smiled without stopping his work. Painting is silence, he said, as if continuing a thought long held. But sculpture is sound. The stone screams until someone listens. Lucia nodded, unsure what to say. His words carried the weight of something she understood, the need to turn pain into creation. Then she noticed another scar, running along his forearm, faint but unmistakable. It looked like the trace of fire. For a moment she wanted to ask, but the look in his eyes, steady, distant, silenced her. That night, back at the house, Lucia opened the window and let the wind rush in. The sound of the sea was the same rhythm she had heard in the church, the same rhythm as Adrian's hands. She closed her eyes and imagined his touch shaping emptiness, giving form to what she had lost. In the dark, she took her brush and dipped it, not into grey, but into deep blue. She painted the sea again, alive now, restless, beating. Outside, the wind grew stronger, and for an instant, Lucia thought she could hear, woven into the waves, the steady rhythm of Adrian's chisel. The rain had returned to San Villaro. Thin veils of mist drifted down from the hills, blurring the line between sea and sky. Lucia walked up the familiar path to the church, her shoes damp with salt and mud. She told herself she only wanted to see how Adrian's work was progressing, but the truth beat louder in her chest. When she entered, the air was heavy with the scent of stone dust. The faint light from the stained glass fell over Adrian's shoulders, tracing his movements in fragments of blue and gold. He didn't notice her at first. His concentration was absolute, his breath matching the rhythm of the chisel. Lucia moved closer, drawn by curiosity, and something more. Then she saw it. The sculpture he worked on was not an angel, as she had imagined. It was a man's face half emerging from marble. The features were delicate, familiar, the curve of the lips, the line of the jaw, the same quiet sadness that once lived in Matteo's eyes. Her breath caught. "Where did you see him?" she whispered. Adrian froze. The sound of the chisel ceased. He looked at her, a flash of something like guilt crossing his face, and then turned away. "I found an old sketch," he murmured. "I didn't know who he was." "You did," Lucia said softly, almost pleading. "You knew him." He said nothing. The silence between them grew heavy, filled with all the things neither dared to name. Lucia stepped back, her chest tight. She looked again at the half-formed face in the marble, the ghost of Matteo reborn in stone. "Don't finish it," she said finally, her voice breaking. "Please, don't." Then she turned and left the church, her steps echoing against the cold walls. Outside, the rain had grown stronger, washing over her face like tears she could no longer hold back. Behind her, inside the empty church, Adrian stood motionless before the unfinished sculpture, his hand trembling over the marble, as if afraid to touch what he himself had brought back to life. The storm lasted through the night. Wind howled against the windows of Lucia's house, and waves crashed so violently against the cliffs that the walls seemed to tremble. She sat near the window, her eyes fixed on the urn resting on the table, the one thing she had not yet dared to open since arriving. Matteo's ashes, what remained of love when stripped of warmth and voice. She thought of Adrian and the sculpture, that impossible image of Matteo's face carved from marble. She told herself it was coincidence, a cruel trick of resemblance, but something inside her refused to believe that. There was truth in the way Adrian had avoided her eyes, in the tremor that passed through his hands when she spoke Matteo's name. By morning, the rain had softened into a steady drizzle. Lucia wrapped herself in her coat and walked down to the beach. The sky was pale, the sea restless but calmer now, as if exhausted by its own fury. She knelt near the edge of the water and ran her fingers through the wet sand. "You would have liked this place," she whispered. "You always said the sea never keeps secrets." The wind carried her voice away. She didn't hear Adrian approach. His footsteps were light against the sand. When she turned, he stood a few feet away, his expression cautious, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Lucia wanted to scream, to ask why, but the words would not come. Instead, she asked, "Who taught you to sculpt like that?" He hesitated. "Fire," he answered at last, "and what it leaves behind." The way he said it, quiet, almost resigned, sent a chill through her. But before she could ask more, he stepped back, giving her space as though afraid that being near her might hurt them both. That night, Lucia painted again. Not grey, not blue, but the deep crimson of the storm that still lingered inside her. When she finished, she stood before the canvas trembling. It wasn't the sea she had painted. It was Matteo's face dissolving into waves. And beneath the layers of color, hidden yet visible, the shape of another, Adrian's hands reaching through the water, trying to save him. The next evening, the wind carried the smell of rain and smoke, the kind that comes from wet wood burning somewhere unseen. Lucia could not sleep. The sound of the sea had changed. It no longer whispered but roared, restless and wild, as if it wanted to tell her something she was still refusing to hear. When the lights in her house flickered and died, she lit a candle and watched the shadows stretch across the walls. Something in her chest urged her to move, to go out, to find him. She didn't know if it was anger, longing, or fear, but her feet found the familiar path to the church. The door creaked when she pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick and warm, heavy with the scent of wax and dust. Candles flickered near the altar, throwing trembling light over Adrian's figure. He was sitting by the unfinished sculpture, his hands covered in marble dust, his face pale in the glow. "You shouldn't be here," he said without looking up. "Neither should you," Lucia answered softly. "It's late." He smiled faintly, though it never reached his eyes. "Time doesn't matter when you're trying to put ghosts to rest." The storm outside broke open, thunder shaking the windows. Lucia moved closer, watching his hands. The scars on them caught the candlelight, red, twisted reminders of something violent and unforgotten. "How did it happen?" she asked. He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. His eyes met hers, steady and full of a sorrow that felt ancient. "In the fire," he said. "I tried to save him." Her breath faltered. The wind howled through the broken window, carrying with it the taste of salt and smoke. "I didn't know it was you," he continued, his voice trembling now. "I didn't know you were the one waiting outside that night." Lucia's heart seemed to stop. The image flashed in her mind. The blaze, the shouting, the figure she had seen through the flames. She had never forgotten the outline of those hands. And now, they were here, scarred, trembling, alive, reaching out to her once more. The wind tore through San Velaro that night, rattling shutters and bending trees, as if the whole village were shivering. Inside the church, Lucia stood frozen, her breath shallow, her eyes locked on Adrian. His words still hung in the air. "I tried to save him." Matteo's name pulsed silently between them, a wound that refused to close. Lucia took a step back. "You were there," she said, her voice trembling. "That night, you were there." Adrian nodded slowly. His hands were shaking, streaked with marble dust and the faint traces of blood from old scars, reopened. "I was the first to arrive. I heard the explosion. I went in, but..." His voice broke. "The smoke was everywhere. I found him by the door. He was still alive." The words tore something inside her. The world seemed to blur. The rain hammering the roof, the echo of thunder, her own heartbeat roaring in her ears. "What happened?" she whispered. Adrian closed his eyes. "He told me to leave him. The flames were closing in and he pushed me out. I tried to go back, but the roof collapsed. I couldn't reach him again." Lucia's tears fell silently. She wanted to hate him, to scream, to make him pay for surviving, but the sight of him broken and trembling made the anger dissolve into something else, something she couldn't name. "You made the sculpture," she said through tears. "His face. You've carried him all this time." Adrian looked at her, his eyes dark and hollow. "I thought if I could bring him back, even in stone, maybe I could make peace with what I couldn't save." The candles flickered violently, as if the air itself was burning. Lucia turned toward the sculpture, Matteo's features forever frozen in the cold marble, perfect and lifeless. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she whispered. "I don't expect you to," Adrian said softly. "But I had to tell you, you deserve the truth." A bolt of lightning split the sky, filling the church with blinding light. For a brief second, all three of them, Lucia, Adrian, and the stone figure of Matteo, stood bathed in the same glow, caught between past and present, between fire and forgiveness. Then the thunder came, and the silence that followed was absolute. By morning, the storm had passed. The sky above San Villaro was pale, washed clean, the sea below still restless but calmer now, breathing like something alive and weary. Lucia hadn't slept. She sat near the window, the candle burned to its end, her eyes raw from crying. Adrian's confession echoed through her mind, every word, every silence that had followed. She wanted to hate him, to erase his face from memory, but all she could feel was the terrible weight of understanding. He hadn't been the fire. He had been trapped in it too. When the first light touched the horizon, Lucia rose. The urn still stood on the table, where it had always been, untouched, patient. She lifted it gently, feeling the fragile balance of what remained inside. She walked through the quiet streets toward the sea. The village was still asleep. Only the church bell chimed once, faintly, somewhere behind her. At the water's edge, she knelt. The waves lapped softly at the shore, pulling at her reflection. "Matteo," she whispered, "I thought love had to survive untouched, but maybe it only lives when it changes." Her voice trembled, breaking in the wind. She opened the urn but didn't scatter the ashes yet. Instead, she sat there, the salt air wrapping around her, the sea humming its endless song. Behind her, footsteps approached, hesitant, then still. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Adrian said quietly. "The church is finished." Lucia nodded. "So is the storm." They stood there in silence for a long time, the air between them filled with the scent of salt and stone dust. When Adrian finally walked away, she didn't stop him. Some endings didn't need to be rewritten. Some belonged to the sea. Lucia closed the urn, just for now, and rose to her feet. The sun had broken through the clouds, faint but golden, spilling light across the water. It touched her face, her hands, the same hands that once painted in grey. Now they longed for colour again. The next morning broke clear and still. The air smelled of salt and pine, the kind of scent that only appears after storms, clean, sharp, alive. Lucia walked once more down to the water, the urn held carefully in her hands. The tide was low, revealing dark rocks glistening under the soft light. The sea no longer roared, it whispered, gentle and constant, as if inviting her closer. For the first time, Lucia wasn't afraid of the silence. She stood for a long moment, looking at the horizon where the grey met gold, where distance became sky. Then she opened the urn. The wind lifted the ashes softly from her hands, carrying them forward, not away, but through the air, mingling them with the sea's breath. The water shimmered, and for an instant she imagined she saw Matteo there, not as a ghost, but as something lighter, brighter, free. Tears came, but they were quiet ones, not of pain, but of release. Behind her, the bell of the church rang once, a single clear note that echoed across the coast. It sounded less like mourning and more like blessing. Lucia stayed until the tide began to rise again. When the first waves reached her feet, she smiled faintly and whispered, "It's all right, you can take him now." Then she turned back toward the village. In the little house by the sea, her easel stood waiting. The last canvas she had painted, the storm, leaned against the wall, still wet, still red with memory. She took a clean one and placed it before her. This time, her brush moved without hesitation. Strokes of blue and gold, white and light, the colors of mourning, of forgiveness, of everything she thought she'd lost but hadn't. When she finally stepped back, she saw it clearly. A woman standing by the sea, her hair tangled by the wind, two shadows behind her, one of light, one of flame. Outside, the waves kept breaking softly against the shore. The sea had taken, the sea had returned, and Lucia, at last, was whole. Weeks passed, and San Velaro began to breathe again. The tourists returned, the fishermen sang on the docks, and the wind that once sounded like morning now carried laughter through the narrow streets. Lucia stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had finally found where she belonged. Each morning she painted with the windows open wide, letting the sea air sweep through her studio. Her new canvases were no longer heavy with grief. They shimmered with light and movement. The grey she once clung to had softened into colours that seemed to pulse with life. The pale gold of dawn, the deep blue of the tides, the warm glow of fading sunsets. Sometimes she still heard the rhythm of Adrian's chisel in the wind, faint but steady, as if the sea itself carried his hands somewhere far away. She hoped he had found peace, that his sculptures now stood in sunlight, not shadow. And Matteo, he was everywhere, in the glint of the waves, in the brushstrokes of her work, in the quiet between one breath and the next. His absence had become presence. His love had become form. One evening, as the horizon blazed with amber fire, Lucia carried her easel to the edge of the cliffs. She set up her paints as the tide rolled in, the sound of the sea steady and eternal beneath her. When she touched her brush to the canvas, it was not sorrow that guided her, but gratitude. She painted the sea as it was now, vast, forgiving, infinite. And at the very heart of it, she painted three lights, one blue, one gold, and one the color of flame. When she was done, she smiled softly. The wind lifted her hair, the sea answered with its endless rhythm, and somewhere between the waves and the sky she felt it. Not loss, not pain, but return. The story was no longer about what she had lost. It was about what had always remained.